There is a book sitting in a climate-controlled vault at Yale University that no one, in the entire history of its known existence, has ever been able to read. Not linguists, not mathematicians, not code breakers who spent their careers dismantling the most complex encryption systems ever devised. Not artificial intelligence trained on hundreds of human languages. The book simply sits there, patient and indifferent, its pages filled with a flowing script that moves from left to right, with illustrations of plants that do not match any species ever cataloged, and diagrams of what appear to be celestial bodies, or perhaps biological systems, or perhaps something no living mind has ever imagined. It is called the Voynich Manuscript, and it is, in the quietest possible way, one of the most humbling objects in the world. The manuscript is believed to date from the early 15th century, based on carbon dating of the vellum, the animal skin on which it was written. It contains approximately 240 pages, though scholars believe some pages have been lost. The illustrations are strange and surprisingly beautiful. There are women bathing in green pools connected by elaborate pipe systems. There are circular diagrams that resemble astronomical charts. There are hundreds of plants, drawn in careful detail, with roots and stems and flowers, but not a single one corresponds to any known botanical species. Whatever world the illustrator was describing, it was not quite this one, or perhaps it was this one seen through a lens we no longer possess. What makes the manuscript so deeply fascinating is not just that it cannot be translated. It is that researchers cannot even agree on whether it is a language at all. Some believe it is an elaborate hoax, created to sell to a wealthy collector by a medieval forger who invented plausible-looking symbols. Others believe it is a genuine constructed language, perhaps a private code used by a specific community, maybe alchemists or herbalists who wish to protect their knowledge. A few have suggested it represents an unknown natural language, something spoken in a region or time we have no record of. Each theory, when examined closely, raises more questions than it answers. What endures is the feeling the manuscript produces when you sit with it. A feeling not of frustration exactly, but of something softer. A quiet awareness that human knowledge has edges. That somewhere, beyond the boundary of what we understand, there are entire systems of meaning waiting, patient as stone, for a mind that can finally receive them. The Voynich Manuscript does not feel threatening in its mystery. It feels, somehow, like a reminder that the world is larger than we remember. And that thought, strangely, is a comforting one. There is a word carved into a wooden post somewhere on the eastern edge of North America, written by someone who has been gone for more than 400 years, and we still do not know what it means. The word is Croatoan. It was the only message left behind when the first English settlement in the Americas, a colony of roughly 115 men, women, and children on Roanoke Island in what is now North Carolina, vanished completely sometime between 1587 and 1590. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no burned buildings, just an empty settlement, a few dismantled structures, and that single carved word on a post near the entrance. John White was the colony's governor, and he had sailed back to England in 1587 to gather more supplies. The voyage home was complicated, and the return was further delayed by the Spanish Armada's conflict with England, which commandeered every available ship. By the time White finally returned to Roanoke in August of 1590, 3 years had passed. He arrived to find silence. The settlement was not destroyed. It appeared to have been deliberately taken apart, as if the colonists had packed their things and left with intention rather than desperation. The word Croton had been carved cleanly, without any cross carved beneath it, which White and the colonists had agreed would signal distress. Whatever had happened, it had not been an emergency, or at least not an obvious one. Croton was the name of a nearby island, now called Hatteras Island, and also the name of the indigenous people who lived there, with whom the colonists had maintained generally peaceful relations. The most widely accepted current theory is that the colonists, unable to wait any longer for supplies, integrated with or sought refuge among the Croton people. Archaeological excavations on Hatteras Island and in nearby areas of present-day North Carolina have found English objects, a metal ring, copper items, pieces of armor, mixed in with indigenous artifacts in layers consistent with the late 16th century. DNA studies of families in the region with traditions of mixed European and native ancestry have added further texture to this possibility. But the truth is that we do not know. We have theories, and some are more supported by evidence than others, but no one has found a document, a grave, a clear and unambiguous record that tells us what happened to those 115 people. They walked away from the only settlement they knew, into a landscape that was vast and wild and deeply unfamiliar to them, and they were absorbed into history without leaving a clear trace. There is something about that image, not tragic exactly, but immense, that lingers. People disappearing not into darkness, but into a world that was already there, waiting. In February of 1959, 9 experienced hikers died on a mountain slope in the northern Ural Mountains of what was then the Soviet Union, and the circumstances of their deaths were strange enough that the investigation files were classified for decades, and the questions raised have never been fully resolved. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. His companions were similarly experienced, students and graduates, people who had completed difficult winter expeditions before. The route they had planned was a known one, rated Category 3, the highest difficulty in the Soviet classification system, but nothing beyond their abilities. They were last seen alive on February 1st, making camp on the slope of a mountain the local Monsey people called Kolit-Syakhl, a name that translates, with unfortunate resonance, as Dead Mountain. When rescuers reached the camp weeks later, they found the tent had been cut open from the inside, and the hikers had fled into the forest in the middle of the night, in temperatures far below freezing, without their boots, without their warm outer clothing. Several of the bodies showed signs of severe internal trauma, crushed ribs, fractured skulls, without the external bruising that would normally accompany such injuries. One of the women was missing her tongue. 2 of the hikers were found with a strange orange-brown discoloration on their skin and hair. Soviet investigators at the time concluded that the deaths were caused by an unknown compelling force, which is perhaps one of the least satisfying official conclusions ever written. In subsequent decades, explanations have ranged from an avalanche to infrasound to military testing to a confrontation with indigenous people to ball lightning to a katabatic wind event, a sudden, powerful downslope wind that can occur without warning in mountainous terrain. In 2019 and 2021, Russian investigators officially concluded that an avalanche or snow slab collapse was the most likely cause, and modern avalanche scientists have built detailed models supporting this conclusion. The internal injuries could be explained by the force of the snow, the flight from the tent, the lack of clothing. These are consistent with the disorientation that accompanies sudden avalanche trauma. And yet the details accumulate in ways that resist clean resolution. The radiation traces found on some clothing. The missing tongue, which some pathologists have explained as post-mortem animal activity and others have disputed. The orange skin discoloration, which some researchers attribute to frostbite and prolonged cold exposure, and others cannot fully explain. The Dyatlov Pass incident is, at its core, a story about 9 people who encountered something unexpected in the dark of a winter mountain night and did what terrified people do. They ran. We may never know exactly what they ran from, but the fact that experienced, rational, capable people could be undone so completely, so swiftly, by something on a quiet mountain slope, that knowledge settles into you slowly. In the year 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers sheltering from a storm near the small island of Antikythera, located between Crete and the Peloponnese, decided to investigate a large rock formation on the seafloor. What they found instead was the wreck of an ancient Roman cargo ship, and within it, among statues and amphorae and bronze vessels, a corroded and barnacle-covered lump of bronze about the size of a shoebox. This lump sat in a Greek museum for years, slowly drying out and crumbling apart, until researchers noticed something extraordinary inside it. Gears. Precisely calibrated, interlocking bronze gears, dozens of them, arranged in a configuration of astonishing sophistication. The Antikythera Mechanism, as it came to be known, dates to somewhere between 150 and 100 BCE. What it does, what it was built to do, is track the movements of the sun and moon, predict eclipses, model the cycles of the planets as understood in ancient Greek astronomy, and even track the schedule of the Olympic Games. It is, in essence, an analog computer, the oldest known mechanical computing device in the world by more than 1,000 years. The next comparable mechanism in terms of engineering complexity does not appear in human history until the medieval astronomical clocks of 14th century Europe. There is a gap of over 1,000 years in which nothing remotely like it has been found. Scholars have spent decades using X-ray tomography and imaging technology to read the inscriptions and map the gear trains of the mechanism's fragments, and the more they learn, the more extraordinary it becomes. It could predict not just lunar cycles, but the varying speed of the moon as it moves through its elliptical orbit, a phenomenon that required sophisticated mathematical modeling to represent mechanically. Some of the inscriptions describe the planetary positions visible from different parts of the Greek world. It was, in a sense, a personalized universe in a box, a device that let a person hold the movements of the cosmos in their hands, spin a dial, and see where the stars would stand on any chosen night. What the mechanism asks us to consider is not just what was lost when ancient knowledge centers like the Library of Alexandria burned, but what else might be sitting, unrecognized, at the bottom of other seas, in the walls of other ruins, in archives that have not yet been opened. The Antikythera Mechanism suggests that human ingenuity in the ancient world reached heights we have repeatedly underestimated. And there is something quietly extraordinary in that, in the idea that the story of human intelligence is not a straight line upward, but something stranger, more spiraling, with peaks and valleys we are still only beginning to map. Somewhere around the year 120 CE, a Roman legion of approximately 5,000 soldiers marched north into the highlands of what is now Scotland, and then vanished from the historical record. The 9th Legion, Legio IX Hispana, was one of Rome's oldest and most distinguished military units. It had served in the conquest of Britain under the Emperor Claudius in 43 CE, had suppressed the revolt of Boudicca, had fought across the empire, and had been stationed at the great fortress of Eboracum, which we now call York. And then, at some point in the early 2nd century, it disappears. No battle record, no official disbandment, no monument to its dissolution, just silence. The mystery was popularized enormously by Rosemary Sutcliffe's 1954 novel The Eagle of the Ninth, which imagined the Legion being destroyed in a catastrophic battle against the Caledonian tribes of Scotland. This story captured something true about how we feel the absence. We want a dramatic finale, a last stand in the mists of the northern hills, an ending worthy of the silence that followed. But historians are more cautious, and the evidence, such as it is, points in several different directions. Inscriptions from the early 2nd century have been found in the Netherlands that appear to reference the 9th Legion, suggesting that at least part of the unit may have been transferred to continental Europe rather than annihilated in Britain. Some scholars now believe the most likely explanation is that the 9th Legion was destroyed not in Scotland, but during the catastrophic Jewish revolt known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt, which took place in Judea between 132 and 136 CE. Roman losses in that conflict were enormous, and it is possible that the 9th was among the units that did not survive it. Others maintain that the Scottish annihilation theory still holds merit, that a significant Roman force did push north of Hadrian's Wall and was destroyed by the Caledonian Confederacy, and that the later inscriptions in Europe represent only a partial detachment that had been separated from the main body before the disaster. The truth is that we may never know with certainty what happened to these 5,000 men. They were real people, soldiers, engineers, cooks, medics, translators, men from Spain and Gaul and North Africa and Britain itself, all serving under the eagle standard of the 9th. They had lives and histories, and presumably deaths, and those deaths went entirely unrecorded in a civilization that was remarkably devoted to record-keeping. That gap in the record is itself a kind of historical mystery, not just where they went, but why their end, whatever it was, left so little trace. History has its silences, and sometimes the silences are as informative as anything written down. On the night of August 15, 1977, a radio telescope at the Big Ear Observatory in Ohio picked up a signal from space that was so unusual, so precisely aligned with what scientists had theorized an extraterrestrial transmission might look like. that the astronomer who reviewed the printout the next morning circled it in red ink and wrote a single word in the margin: wow. The signal, now known simply as the WOW signal, lasted for exactly 72 seconds, the maximum duration that the Big Ear telescope could observe any given point in space as the Earth rotated, and it has never been detected again, despite decades of searching. What made the signal so striking was how closely it matched the theoretical profile of an artificial transmission from space. It came from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius. It arrived on a frequency of approximately 1420 MHz, which is the frequency at which neutral hydrogen emits radio waves, a frequency that scientists had long argued any technologically advanced civilization would choose for communication because it is a universal constant, recognizable to anyone with knowledge of physics. The signal was narrowband, focused, and far more powerful than any natural phenomenon known to produce radio emissions at that frequency from that region of space. It was, in every measurable respect, precisely what a message from another civilization might look like. And then it was gone. Dozens of subsequent observations of that region of sky, using increasingly powerful instruments, have detected nothing remotely similar. In 2016, a team of scientists proposed that the signal might have been caused by a pair of comets passing through the field of observation, their hydrogen clouds momentarily producing a natural narrowband emission. This explanation was contested by other researchers, who pointed out that the precise frequency and intensity of the WOW signal were inconsistent with known cometary emissions. The cometary hypothesis remains one possible explanation among several, none of which has achieved consensus. What the WOW signal leaves behind is not quite hope and not quite certainty, but something more interesting than either, a data point that has not been disproven, filed in the ongoing and largely unanswered question of whether we are alone. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. It contains more stars than there are grains of sand on every beach on Earth. If life arose here, on this particular grain of sand, the probability mathematics of the situation suggest it may have arisen elsewhere too. The WOW signal does not prove that. But for 72 seconds on a summer night in 1977, something out there was worth noticing. And that, even as an open question, has its own quiet weight. There is a type of maritime mystery that involves finding a ship at sea that is entirely intact, fully stocked with provisions and cargo, its sails set, and its course maintained, with no living person on board and no obvious explanation for their absence. It sounds like the setup for a story, but it has happened, and the most famous and thoroughly documented instance of it occurred in December of 1872, when a British brigantine called the Dei Grazia spotted a vessel drifting erratically in the Atlantic Ocean between the Azores and the coast of Portugal. The vessel was the Mary Celeste, an American merchant ship that had left New York Harbor 8 days earlier, bound for Genoa with a cargo of 1,700 barrels of commercial alcohol. When the crew of the Dei Grazia boarded the Mary Celeste, they found the ship in surprisingly good order. There was food in the galley. The cargo was largely intact, though about 9 barrels of alcohol had been found empty. The captain's personal belongings were still in his cabin, along with a sword and a sewing machine and his wife's jewelry. The ship's log had entries up to November 24th, 10 days before the Mary Celeste was found. The last recorded position placed the ship about 400 miles from where it was discovered drifting. The ship's chronometer and sextant were missing. The single lifeboat was gone, and there was no sign of Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife and infant daughter, or the 7 crew members who had sailed with them. 10 people had simply left a ship that appeared to have no reason to be abandoned. Theories over the years have included the obvious: piracy, mutiny, a waterspout, a seaquake, and the more exotic, including alcohol fumes from the leaking barrels igniting and causing a brief explosion that frightened the crew into the lifeboat, which then became separated from the ship. This last explanation, proposed and refined by several maritime historians, has gained the most traction. A forensic experiment conducted in 2006 demonstrated that commercial alcohol of the type being transported can produce a brief but impressive explosion of flames that leaves no char marks or lasting fire, which would explain the absence of fire damage on the ship. The crew may have abandoned it in panic, believing it was about to explode, and then watched from the lifeboat as the ship drifted beyond their ability to reboard. The Mary Celeste was eventually sold, changed hands many times, and was finally deliberately wrecked in 1885 in an insurance fraud scheme by one of her later captains. She sank off the coast of Haiti, taking whatever remaining secrets she held to the bottom of the Caribbean. What persists is the image of the ship as it was found. Sails set, compass steady, a meal perhaps still warm somewhere in the galley, belonging to people who had stepped away from their lives so quickly that everything they owned was still in its place. There is something in that image, the ghost of normalcy, the life-sized outline of people who were there and then were not, that the mind keeps returning to, as if looking for the moment when everything changed. Off the southern coast of Nova Scotia, Canada, there is a small island roughly a mile long and half a mile wide, covered in oak trees and unremarkable in almost every respect except one. For more than 220 years, people have been digging holes in it, spending fortunes and occasionally their lives, in pursuit of a treasure that may or may not exist. The Oak Island Money Pit, as it has come to be known, was allegedly discovered in 1795 by a teenager named Daniel McGinnis, who noticed a circular depression in the ground and, with two friends, began to dig. According to the story that has been passed down, they found a layer of flagstones at 2 feet deep, then logs at 10-foot intervals as they descended, then a stone with a mysterious inscription, then water, then more layers of obstruction, and finally had to abandon the dig when the pit flooded completely. What followed over the next 2 centuries is a remarkable record of human persistence in the face of almost total frustration. Syndicate after syndicate, generation after generation, tried to reach the bottom of the pit, and the pit resisted every effort. When they pumped water out, it flooded again. When they drilled down, they retrieved tantalizing objects, fragments of parchment, a piece of gold chain, traces of metal at great depth, but could never excavate far enough to reach whatever lay below. At least 6 people died in digging accidents over the years, giving rise to a local saying that the pit would claim 7 lives before it surrendered its secret. Prominent searchers over the years have included, according to various accounts, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who participated in a dig as a young man and reportedly stayed interested in the pit for the rest of his life. Modern archaeological and geological analysis has offered a sobering counter-narrative. Many researchers now believe that the flooding in the pit is not the result of a deliberately engineered flood tunnel, as treasure hunters have always believed, but simply a natural consequence of the coastal geology of the island. Nova Scotia's coastline has significant underground water systems, and what appears to be a cleverly designed booby trap may simply be the ocean doing what the ocean does. The strange layering of logs and materials found by early diggers may have been the result of natural soil collapse and debris accumulation over centuries, misinterpreted as evidence of deliberate construction. And yet the island continues to draw people. The search continues on a television series that has aired for more than a decade. Millions of dollars have been spent. The question of whether anything was ever deliberately buried on Oak Island may ultimately be less interesting than the question of what it reveals about us, about the persistence of hope in the face of evidence, the willingness to keep digging even when the ground keeps filling with water. Oak Island is, in a sense, a mirror more than a mystery. It reflects back whatever we most want to find. And that may be why, after all these years, the digging never quite stops. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, somewhere over the remote taiga forest of what is now the Krasnoyarsk region of Siberia, something exploded. Not on the ground, but in the air. A cosmic object, most likely a fragment of a comet or an asteroid, that entered the Earth's atmosphere and detonated before it ever reached the surface. The explosion released energy estimated at between 10 and 15 megatons of TNT, approximately 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The blast flattened approximately 2,000 square kilometers of forest, knocking down an estimated 80 million trees in a radial pattern around the explosion's epicenter. Windows were shattered hundreds of miles away. The shockwave was detected on barographs around the world. People working in the fields 60 kilometers away were knocked off their feet. What makes the Tunguska Event scientifically extraordinary is also what makes it so strange. There is no crater. A cosmic impact of that energy would typically leave a massive impact crater. But because the object exploded in the atmosphere several kilometers above the ground, it released its energy as a pressure wave rather than a physical impact. The forest was destroyed, but the ground beneath it was largely intact. The remoteness of the location meant that no major settlement was affected, though reindeer herds were killed and local Evenki people described an immense fireball and a sound like cannon fire that knocked them from their feet. Because the region was so inaccessible, the first scientific expedition did not reach the site until 1927, nearly 2 decades after the event. Initial theories range from a natural gas eruption to a meteorite to, in later and less rigorous accounts, an alien spacecraft. Modern science has settled on the most parsimonious explanation, an asteroid or comet fragment, somewhere between 50 and 80 meters in diameter, that entered the atmosphere at high speed and was destroyed by the aerodynamic pressure before it reached the ground, what scientists call an airburst. Small fragments of extraterrestrial material have been found in peat layers from the year 1908 in the area, consistent with this explanation. The 2013 Chelyabinsk meteor event in Russia, which also produced a significant airburst and injured over 1,000 people, provided a modern analog that helped confirm the Tunguska model. And yet there is something about Tunguska that the dry language of planetary science cannot entirely contain. This was a Tuesday morning in 1908. People were beginning their days, tending their animals, perhaps making tea, somewhere in the vast forests of Siberia, when the sky caught fire and the ground heaved and the trees fell for miles in every direction. The universe had sent something our way, and it had missed the Earth's surface by the narrowest of atmospheric margins. If it had arrived a few hours earlier or later, as the Earth rotated, it might have struck a city. It did not. It fell in one of the emptiest places on the planet, and the trees absorbed the blow, and the world went on. There is a quiet gratitude in that, if you let yourself feel it. In the high desert of northern New Mexico, in and around the town of Taos, a persistent, low-frequency sound has been reported by some residents for decades, a sound that has been described variously as a diesel engine idling somewhere in the distance, a distant drumming, a vibration felt as much as heard, a tone that sits at the very low edge of human perception and does not go away. It is there at night, apparently, and in the morning, and in the quiet of the afternoon. It is louder indoors than outside, which is the opposite of how external sounds behave. It cannot be recorded by microphones, and only a certain percentage of people, estimates range from 2 to 4% of the population in affected areas, are able to hear it at all. The Taos Hum is not unique to Taos. Similar phenomena have been reported in Bristol, England, where it became known as the Bristol Hum, and in Largs, Scotland, and in various other locations around the world. In each case, the pattern is similar, a low, persistent drone audible to a minority of local residents, undetectable by conventional recording equipment, maddening in its constancy, and deeply resistant to explanation. In Taos, a formal scientific study was conducted in the early 1990s by a team of researchers from the University of New Mexico and other institutions. The team used sensitive measurement equipment, conducted extensive surveys of residents, and ultimately concluded that they could neither identify the source of the hum nor definitively confirm that it was an external physical sound rather than a physiological phenomenon experienced by certain individuals. Several hypotheses have been proposed. Industrial sources, underground gas pipelines, military activity at nearby installations, HARP-type facilities, have been investigated and generally ruled out as primary causes. A more recent and widely discussed hypothesis proposes that the hum is a form of otoacoustic emission, a sound produced by the inner ear itself, specifically by the hair cells of the cochlea oscillating spontaneously. A subset of people may have ears that are particularly sensitive to infrasound, very low-frequency vibrations below the normal range of hearing that are generated by a variety of industrial, geological, and atmospheric processes. These infrasound waves could be interacting with the inner ear in a way that some people experience as sound and others do not. What the Taos Hum offers, beyond its own strange facts, is a gentle reminder that perception is not a window, it is an interpretation. What some people hear, clearly and constantly, others cannot detect at all. The same physical world is being processed by different bodies, different nervous systems, and producing completely different experiences. A sound that fills someone's waking hours with unease is simply absent for their neighbor sitting in the same room. We tend to think of reality as something shared, agreed upon, consistent. But the Taos Hum suggests that the boundary between the world outside and the world inside is more porous and more personal than we usually remember. It is worth pausing, somewhere in the middle of all these unanswered questions, to simply wonder why they feel so compelling. Why does the mind reach toward a mystery the way the eye reaches toward a distant light? There is something almost involuntary about it, the way an unsolved problem occupies a different kind of mental space than a solved one, hovering at the edge of attention, drawing you back again and again. This is not a flaw in the way we think. It appears to be something much more fundamental than that. The pull toward mystery may be one of the oldest and most useful features of the human mind, worn smooth by hundreds of thousands of years of it being exactly the right response to have. Consider what a mystery represents at its most basic level. It is information that is known to exist, but that has not yet been received. Something happened. Something caused it. The cause and the something are real. They were real at some moment in time, but we do not yet have access to them. The mind, trained by evolution to find patterns and causes and explanations as a survival strategy, treats this gap as a kind of open circuit. Energy flows toward the gap. Attention is directed at the gap. We return to the gap again and again because the brain's deep machinery classifies it as a problem that is worth solving, even if the conscious mind knows perfectly well that the solution may never come. Psychologists who study curiosity have described it as an aversive state, not entirely pleasant, not comfortable in the way that satisfaction is comfortable. Being curious about something means experiencing the gap between what you know and what you want to know, and that gap can produce a low-level unease that persists until it is resolved. But humans do not avoid this state. We seek it out. We read mystery novels and watch detective shows and stay up late thinking about ancient manuscripts in university vaults and radio signals from the direction of Sagittarius. We choose to enter the state of not knowing because somewhere in the evolution of human consciousness, the pleasure of seeking became intertwined with the discomfort of the gap. The search itself became its own reward. What this means, when you sit with it, is that mystery is not a failure of knowledge. It is a precondition for it. Every piece of understanding humanity has ever accumulated began as a mystery, as a gap in the circuit that someone could not stop returning to. The Antikythera Mechanism sat on the seafloor for 2,000 years, and then someone found it and could not stop asking what it was. The compulsion to know and the capacity to be haunted by not knowing may be the same thing. And so the mysteries we carry, unresolved, are not burdens. They are, in a very real sense, invitations. The human brain does not experience raw reality. It constructs experience, moment by moment, using a combination of incoming sensory data and prior expectations, filling in gaps, smoothing over inconsistencies, inferring causes and connections that may or may not actually be there. This is not a defect. It is enormously efficient. The brain receives far more sensory input than it could ever fully process, and so it makes predictions, compresses information, and lets the gaps fill themselves with the most statistically likely answer based on previous experience. Most of the time, this works beautifully, but it also means that the brain has a deep and abiding need to explain things, to place events inside a causal framework, to connect the dots, even when the dots may not actually connect. This drive toward explanation is so powerful that when genuine explanations are not available, the brain will generate them anyway. Research into what neurologists sometimes call the left hemisphere interpreter, a concept developed from studies of split-brain patients, suggests that the brain has a mechanism dedicated to creating narrative coherence, to constructing explanations for events even when the explanations are confabulated rather than accurate. In split-brain patients, whose two cerebral hemispheres cannot communicate with each other, the left hemisphere will confidently explain behaviors that were actually initiated by the right hemisphere, generating plausible-sounding stories in real time, completely unaware that it has no actual knowledge of the cause. The interpreter makes things up, and it does so with total confidence. This tendency expresses itself in many ways in ordinary life. It is why conspiracy theories are difficult to dislodge even in the face of contradicting evidence, because the brain that has constructed an explanation experiences the explanation as reality, not as hypothesis. It is why eyewitness testimony is less reliable than we tend to believe, because memory reconstructs rather than replays, filling in what must have been true rather than what was actually perceived. It is why, when we look at clouds or rock formations or the static on an old television, we see faces and figures that are not there. A phenomenon called pareidolia, the brain's pattern detection system operating in the absence of actual patterns, finding them anyway, because finding them is what it does. And understanding this about ourselves does not diminish us. It makes us, if anything, more interesting. We are creatures who cannot help but seek meaning, cannot help but build stories, cannot help but look at the void and find shapes in it. The unsolved mysteries of history persist partly because they are genuinely incomplete. The evidence is insufficient, the records are gone, the witnesses are dust. But they persist also because our minds reach toward them and hold them, turning them in the light, looking for the angle at which they resolve. That is what minds do. And there is something quietly beautiful in that, even when the resolution never comes. There is an experience that almost everyone has had at some point. The feeling of a coincidence that seems too precise to be accidental. You think of someone you have not spoken to in years, and an hour later they send you a message. You read a word you have never encountered before, and then find it 3 times in the next week. You dream of a place, and the next day someone describes that exact place in a conversation. These things happen. They feel significant. And the reason they feel significant is that the brain, which we have just established is a pattern recognition device of extraordinary sensitivity, does not have an easy way of flagging random coincidence as a category distinct from meaningful connection. The mathematician's answer to this experience is probability. With enough events happening every day, enough thoughts, enough encounters, enough words read and spoken and heard, the sheer volume of possible coincidences means that improbable-seeming things will occur with regular frequency. The ones that happen to match something we were already thinking about will be noticed and remembered. The thousands of non-matches, the times you thought of someone and they did not call, the times a word appeared once and never again, are forgotten because the brain does not tag them as meaningful. This is what statisticians call the law of large numbers, and it is, in its quiet way, a sufficient explanation for most experiences of meaningful coincidence. The pattern was always there. The signal was us. But the interesting question is not whether the coincidences are random. They almost certainly are, but why the experience of them feels so different from the mathematics. Why does a statistical improbability feel like a message? Part of the answer is evolutionary. For most of human history, coincidences were not random. A sound in the bushes that coincided with the arrival of a predator the last time you heard it was not a coincidence to be philosophically evaluated. It was a warning to be acted on immediately. The brain that survived was the brain that found connections quickly, even if it found some that were not there. Overdetection was safer than underdetection. And so we inherited minds that are exquisitely tuned to find meaning in coincidence, because for hundreds of thousands of years, that tuning saved lives. What we do with this knowledge is the interesting part. We can hold it lightly, acknowledging that the coincidence feels meaningful without insisting that it must be, sitting in the space between the feeling and the explanation without needing to resolve it immediately. The patterns we find in randomness are not lies that our minds tell us. They are something more interesting than that. They are proof that we are looking, that we are engaged with the world, that we are paying attention, that we are alive to the possibility that things connect. Whether they actually do is a separate question. And sometimes, the looking is enough. There is a concept in narrative theory called the Zygarnik effect, named after the Soviet psychologist Bluma Zygarnik, who in the 1920s observed that waiters in a cafe could remember the details of uncompleted orders far more vividly than completed ones. Once a transaction was finished, the memory of it faded relatively quickly, but an interrupted or unresolved task stayed sharply present in the mind until it was completed. Zygarnik proposed that uncompleted tasks create a kind of cognitive tension, what might now be described as a persistent activation in working memory, that keeps them foreground until they can be resolved. The brain treats unfinished business as a priority queue. Applied to stories, this means that the endings we do not get are often more haunting than the endings we receive. A story that concludes satisfyingly can be set down and left behind. A story that ends in silence, or that simply stops, with no resolution, no answer, no final chapter, stays open in the mind, returning again and again in quiet moments, calling for attention that can never quite supply what it needs. The lost colony of Roanoke is more haunting than the countless colonial settlements that simply dwindled and failed, because it ends with a question. The Dyatlov Pass incident is more haunting than mountain accidents with known causes, because the explanation it offers is always slightly insufficient. The unresolved story is the story that stays. There is also something worth noticing about the particular mysteries that tend to endure in cultural memory across generations. They are almost always mysteries that involve people rather than things. The Voynich Manuscript would be interesting if it were simply an undeciphered script, but it is more interesting because someone made it, held it, wrote in it, perhaps spent years of their life on it. The 9 hikers of Dyatlov Pass would be a geological curiosity if we did not know their names, their ages, the photographs they took in the days before their deaths. The stories that persist are the ones attached to human beings, because we track human beings the way no other kind of story compels us. We follow the person into the dark, and when they do not come back, we wait at the edge of the darkness, wondering. That waiting is not futile. It is, in its way, a form of witness. To keep asking what happened to the colony on Roanoke is to refuse to let those people be simply erased. To keep reading the pages of the Voynich Manuscript is to keep faith with whoever spent their time writing it. The unsolved story is also an act of sustained attention, a refusal to move on, a kind of loyalty to the unanswered question. And in that loyalty, there is something that feels less like frustration and more like a quiet, enduring form of care. It seems counterintuitive, but there is real comfort in the unanswered question if you let yourself settle into it. We are conditioned, in most areas of life, to treat incomplete information as a problem to be solved, a gap to be closed, a source of unease to be resolved as quickly as possible. Uncertainty is something we are taught to manage, minimize, and where possible eliminate. The unresolved mystery, from this perspective, is a kind of failure, information that should be available and is not, a gap in the otherwise solid floor of what we know. But there is another way of being with the unanswered question, one that does not require resolution in order to feel complete. Consider that the alternative to mystery is full knowledge, complete information about every event, every cause, every outcome. And while that might sound like a kind of paradise to the anxiety-prone mind, there is something in it that feels like a loss. A world in which everything is known is also a world in which nothing is surprising, nothing is awaiting discovery, nothing is inviting exploration. The mystery is, in a very real sense, what keeps the world open. It is the horizon that keeps receding as you walk toward it. Not a cruelty of geography, but a gift that means there will always be somewhere new to go. To live in a world with genuine mysteries is to live in a world that is not yet finished, that is still becoming, that holds things you have not yet seen. The unanswered question also offers a particular kind of mental freedom, the freedom of not yet knowing. Once a question is resolved, its resolution becomes the only possible answer. The Tunguska Event is now understood as an airburst, and while that understanding is valuable and important, something is closed that was once open. Before the explanation, the event could have been anything. It was a space of pure possibility, before the arrival of the most probable cause. There is a version of intellectual life in which that openness, that pre-explanation space, is something to be savored rather than raced through, because the wondering is its own form of knowing, and it carries its own particular quality of aliveness. None of this is an argument for staying ignorant. Knowledge is good, and the pursuit of it is one of the finest things human minds do. But alongside the pursuit, there can be a practice of sitting with what is not yet known, not impatiently, but with a kind of receptive attention, the way you would sit with something beautiful before trying to describe it. The unanswered question asks something of us. It asks us to stay, to remain present with the not knowing, to let it be what it is, without demanding that it become something else. And in that staying, there is a particular quietness that is not the quietness of emptiness, but the quietness of being very attentive to something vast. There is a distinction worth making between curiosity as an urgent drive, the need to know, the itch that must be scratched, the question that demands an answer, and curiosity as something softer, what might be called receptive curiosity or wonder. The difference is not always easy to feel from the inside, but it is real. Urgent curiosity is oriented toward the future, toward the moment when the answer arrives and the tension resolves. Wondering is oriented toward the present, toward the quality of attention being paid right now, to the thing as it is, the question as it stands, the mystery in its full and unresolved form. Wonder is older than the scientific method, though the scientific method was born from it. Aristotle, in the opening lines of his Metaphysics, wrote that all human beings by nature desire to know, and he connected this desire not to the satisfaction of finding answers, but to the pleasure of sensation itself, to the way the eye takes in light and the mind takes in the world. The desire to know is, in this reading, inseparable from the capacity to be struck by things, to find them worth attending to experience the world as something genuinely remarkable rather than something to be processed and filed. Wonder is what happens when the attention opens rather than narrows, when it encounters something that does not quite fit into any existing category and simply holds it, turning it gently, feeling its edges. The mysteries we have been considering tonight are all, in one way or another, invitations to wonder. They are places where the ordinary fabric of explanation has a hole in it, and through the hole, something else is visible, some quality of the world that resists the usual framing. A manuscript in a language no one can read is a hole in the fabric of human communication. A signal from deep space that arrived once and never returned is a hole in the fabric of known astrophysics. A group of experienced hikers who fled their tent in the middle of a winter night in the Ural Mountains is a hole in the fabric of what we think we know about fear and survival and what the wilderness holds. Each hole lets in a kind of light that is not available anywhere else. To approach these holes with wonder rather than only with the urgent need to close them is a skill, and like most skills, it improves with practice. It requires a certain willingness to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously without forcing resolution. It requires the ability to find the question itself beautiful, independent of whether an answer is forthcoming. And it requires, perhaps most importantly, a quality of patience. The kind of patience that is not passive waiting but active, engaged presence with something that is not yet finished revealing itself. Wonder is patient. It can wait. It does not need the answer tonight. It is content, for now, with the question. There is a philosophical position that has been articulated in different forms across many traditions of thought, and it is roughly this, that the acceptance of genuine uncertainty, not as a temporary state to be corrected, but as a permanent feature of what it means to be a finite mind in a vast and complex world, is not a defeat, but a kind of maturity. The ancient Socratic insight that wisdom begins with the recognition of what one does not know has been echoed in Zen teachings about beginner's mind, in the negative capability that the poet John Keats described as the capacity to remain in uncertainty without irritable reaching after fact and reason, in the scientific principle of epistemic humility that asks researchers to hold their conclusions loosely, aware that better evidence may shift them. What these traditions share is a reorientation toward not knowing that transforms it from something threatening into something generative. The person who is comfortable with uncertainty does not become passive or incurious, quite the opposite. Comfort with not knowing is actually a prerequisite for deep inquiry, because deep inquiry requires the willingness to find your current model wrong, to hold your current explanation as provisional, to remain genuinely open to evidence that contradicts what you thought you understood. Certainty, ironically, is what closes inquiry down. The person who is certain has arrived. The person who is comfortable with uncertainty is always still traveling, which means they are always still learning. The historical mysteries we have been walking through tonight are, in a sense, a collection of places where human inquiry has reached its current edge. The wow signal sits at the edge of what our instruments can detect and interpret. The Voynich Manuscript sits at the edge of what our linguistic tools can decode. The Antikythera Mechanism sat at the edge of what we believed ancient technology was capable of, and it moved that edge significantly when we understood it better. Each mystery is, in this reading, not a failure of knowledge but a frontier, a place where the known world ends and the unknown begins, and where the act of standing at the edge and looking out is itself meaningful, even before you take another step. Accepting that some things remain unknown is not the same as giving up on knowing them. It is more like settling into a long journey without insisting that you can already see the destination. The Roanoke colonists who carved Croton into a post and walked away from everything they had built were doing something brave and practical. They were accepting the limits of their situation and moving toward whatever lay beyond it. We do not know what they found, but the act of moving, of accepting that the current situation was insufficient and that something else was possible, even in the face of complete uncertainty, that act is something we recognize. It is something we do too, in our own quieter ways, every time we let go of the need to have the answer tonight. History is often presented as a body of established knowledge, dates, events, causes, outcomes, recorded in books and curricula, and taught to successive generations as the settled facts of what occurred. And much of it is settled, as well as human inquiry can settle anything. We know when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, broadly speaking. We know the sequence of events that ended the First World War. We know the shape of the technological changes that accompanied the Industrial Revolution. The past is not entirely opaque to us, and the accumulated work of historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, and scientists has given us an extraordinarily detailed picture of how the world came to be as it is. But the deeper you go into the past, the more the settled facts give way to interpretations, to fragments, to educated guesses dressed in careful language. The further back you travel, the more the record becomes partial, the sources become tendentious, the physical evidence becomes scarce. The disappearance of the Ninth Legion is a mystery in part because Roman record-keeping, impressive as it was not comprehensive. There were things Rome did not write down, or wrote down in documents that did not survive, or chose not to commemorate because they were failures rather than triumphs. History has, woven through its fabric, a continuous thread of gaps and silences and moments where the record simply stops and we are left to imagine. And beyond the silences of individual events, there is the larger silence of the lives that were never recorded at all. The colonists of Roanoke are memorable in part because they had names and a date and a written record of their departure. But for every named disappearance in history, there are millions of unrecorded lives that passed through the world and left no trace. Ordinary people in ordinary places in ordinary times, living their entire lives without anyone writing anything down about them. The past is not just a collection of mysteries. It is, in a deeper sense, mostly unknown, a vast continent of human experience of which we have only a very small and unrepresentative map. This is humbling, but it is also a kind of liberation. If most of human experience is unknown, then the stories we carry, the ones passed down, the ones excavated, the ones decoded and argued over, are not the whole picture. They are points of light in a much larger darkness. And the darkness itself is not empty. It is full of lives that were lived, thoughts that were thought, languages that were spoken, discoveries that were made and then lost. We are not the first people to wonder about the stars, or to carve something into a surface hoping it would last, or to feel the pull of a mystery that seemed to matter. We are part of a continuous thread of questioning that goes further back than we can easily imagine. History's endless questions are, in a very real sense, our questions. We did not create them from nothing. We inherited them. There is a particular quality of evening, perhaps you have felt it, when the day's business has wound down and the light has changed and there is nothing urgent requiring your attention, and in that quietness you become aware of how much of the world simply continues without your participation or oversight. The trees continue. The stars come out. The distant hum of the town or the city or the countryside settles into itself. And you are aware, not anxiously but almost peacefully, that you do not know what is happening in most of the world right now. You do not know what most people are thinking or doing or feeling. You do not know what signals are passing through the atmosphere, what ships are crossing what seas, what someone in a distant city is whispering to someone else in the dark. The world is far larger than your awareness of it. And in this quiet moment, that feels not threatening, but somehow restful. The calm of not knowing everything is related to, but distinct from, the acceptance of uncertainty we were considering a moment ago. The acceptance of uncertainty is more active. It involves a conscious choice to hold conclusions loosely, to remain open to revision, to sustain inquiry without demanding resolution. The calm of not knowing everything is more passive, more receptive. It is less about how we hold questions and more about the discovery that we do not need to hold all of them at once. The world contains more mysteries than any single mind can attend to. And rather than being a source of anxiety, all those unattended questions, all that unknowing, it can be experienced as a form of abundance. There is always more. The mystery does not run out. This quality of calmness in the face of vast unknowing is not unique to any one tradition or time. The ancient Greeks had a word, aporia, which referred to a state of genuine perplexity, not the false perplexity of someone who simply hasn't looked hard enough, but the real perplexity that comes from looking deeply at something and finding that it truly does not resolve. Plato's Socratic dialogues are full of these moments, conversations that end not in answers, but in better formulated questions, a kind of productive bewilderment. Some scholars argue that this productive bewilderment was not a failure of Socratic method, but its entire point. To arrive at a place of genuine, clear-eyed not knowing is itself a philosophical achievement, because it clears away the false certainties that prevent real inquiry from beginning. To not know everything is the default condition of every mind that has ever existed. The most learned person who ever lived knew only a fraction of what there is to know. The most advanced civilization in human history has explained only a portion of what awaits explanation. And rather than measuring ourselves against the totality of what remains unknown, which would be an exercise in guaranteed inadequacy, we can choose to measure ourselves against the quality of our attention, the depth of our wonder, the patience of our inquiry. What we know well, we know well. What we do not yet know, we can hold with curiosity rather than with dread. And in between the knowing and the not knowing, there is a great deal of space to simply be, quietly, without needing to resolve every question before the night is over. And so here we are, at the end of a long night of questions. Not answers, there have been very few of those, but questions that have been turned over gently, examined from different angles, set down and picked up again, and finally, perhaps, set down for the night with something approaching peace. The Voynich Manuscript is still in its vault at Yale, its script still flowing in lines that no one can read. The Roanoke colonists are still wherever they went, centuries past reaching. The Dyatlov hikers are still in the ground in the Ural Mountains, their last night still not fully reconstructed. The WOW signal still occupies its 72 seconds of summer 1977, still unrepeated, still unexplained. And the forest at Tunguska is still, slowly, after more than 100 years, returning to what it was before the sky caught fire. None of these mysteries need to be resolved tonight. They have been unresolved for decades, for centuries, for millennia. They can rest with their uncertainty for one more night, as they have rested for all the other nights since they became mysteries. And we can rest too, not in the restlessness of unfinished business, but in the softer awareness that we are part of a long, unfinished conversation between curious minds and a world that is under no obligation to explain itself. The universe does not owe us answers. It gives us the question. It gives us the capacity to ask. And somehow, that seems like enough. There is a passage in the life of every long inquiry, every genuine effort to understand something that resists understanding, where the person doing the inquiring realizes that the thing they are studying has changed them more than they have changed it. The Voynich Manuscript has not yielded to centuries of attempted translation, but the people who have attempted that translation have been shaped by the attempt, sharpened, humbled, deepened. The Oak Island money pit has not surrendered its secrets, but the persistence of the people who searched it says something real and enduring about the human need to believe that something important is waiting just below the surface. We are marked by our mysteries as much as by our discoveries. The brain, settling toward sleep, does something interesting with the questions it has been carrying through the day. It does not simply discard them. The sleeping mind continues to process, continues to search quietly through its networks, occasionally surfacing something in the morning that was not visible the night before. The mysteries you have been thinking about tonight will continue, in whatever quiet and private way the sleeping mind works, to be considered. The Antikythera Mechanism and its 1,000-year gap. The Ninth Legion and its complete disappearance from the record. The Taos Hum and its sound that some people hear and others cannot. These are not problems to be solved before you sleep. They are companions for the journey into sleep. Presences that keep the mind gently occupied while the body rests. Something interesting to think about in the space between wakefulness and dreams. What remains, after all the questions, is something that might be called spaciousness, the sense of a mind that has been widened by its encounter with things it cannot fully contain. This is what the best mysteries do, not distress us with what we do not know, but expand us with the awareness of how much there is to know. The universe is larger than our instruments. History is deeper than our records. The human mind is stranger and more capable than any single theory of it can explain. And somewhere in that largeness, in that depth, in that strangeness, everything that has ever puzzled anyone is still quietly waiting, patient, unhurried, entirely at home in its own uncertainty, for the mind that is ready to sit with it, without rushing, without demanding, without needing to be anywhere other than exactly here, in the soft and wondering dark.